Courtney, lovely to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
So tell us about how Shane became Courtney. I mean, how did you get into drag in the first place?
I went to a theatre school and I would dress up as a mouse in Cinderella, or, I don't know if this is politically correct anymore, but a dwarf in Snow White, and different, you know, different people who weren't me. So to put on clothes of a different gender was just kind of seemed quite normal by the time I got around to it. And when I was 18, I think, well, it was when Courtney was born, when drag sort of really began. And I went to, you know, a circuit party in Melbourne on New Year's Eve with some friends and got all gussied up and realised that it was super great fun. And as a performer, I was always looking for, like, you know, when you're a performer, you're a singer, dancer, actor, you kind of have to wait quite often for someone else to give you a go. But the cool thing about drag is you just turn up to your local, you know, drag pageant or whatever and get on stage, and there's always been work opportunities for me, which is wonderful, whether it was, you know, hosting a Christmas special on Channel 4 or hosting karaoke on Monday night at a gay bar in West Hollywood. So it's just been a place where I could always express my sort of performance side really easily. So
is Courtney a character, or I mean, I'm trying to work out where Shane ends, Courtney begins, or are they all like one and the same?
We're like two ends of the same stick.
Right.
And every person is different. Like someone like Dame Edna, for example, Barry Humphries is one person, Dame Edna is a character, never the twain shall meet. Whereas for me, drag is just a different aesthetic, but still very much the same person. So I could be sitting here, you know, in boys' clothes, and you would get the same answers and the same. I'd probably be like sitting slightly less girly,
sure,
and I'd be a bit more comfortable.
So do you think drag is capable of being as subversive as it once was?
Yeah, and I think the fact that probably a lot of people watching right now won't even think about this being subversive, because I present like a cis woman, and I think sometimes the brain, especially men are very visual creatures, and so when they see something that looks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's just like, oh yeah, there's a duck on television. And then when you sort of look into it and you're like, hang on, wait, there's a man dressed as a woman talking about what it, and now that it's happening in the mainstream, I think it's even more subversive. But it subverts culture in different ways, I think, and different people's drag does that. Like if you look around, you have drag queens in Vogue Italy and Vogue America, and you have drag queens on runways, you have drag queens with makeup brands, with pop music that is, you know, charting in the Billboard charts. You have all sorts of, you know, Bianca Del Rio is a drag queen who, her show is on sale at Wembley Arena. Like, that's 14,000 seats. Like, that's as mainstream as it gets. But then to have this performer who, you know, a few years ago was, you know, hosting bingo at a gay bar in New York City, to now be so mainstreamly accepted. And everybody's style of drag is different, which is what makes it wonderful. And I think that whilst every entertainer is different, I think drag, you can visually see the difference between each person, because we're not confined to what regular humans look like. I aim to confuse, and I think that...
You're doing well.
Well, because for me, there's this fascinating concept of, like, what is gender and what is attraction, and I haven't gotten to the bottom of it yet, but I do know that I've dated and had sexual relations with straight identifying men who were kind of like, oh, yeah, oh, wait, what, that's not a Sheila, hang on, oh, well. And it's quite fascinating, because we do have these quite rigid and binary ideas of gender and sexuality. And it's funny, because I think my drag does intersect with gender and sexuality. For me personally, I like the term gender fluid really helped me come to terms with my masculinity and femininity. Growing up in Australia, you know, in a very masculine sort of culture, I never felt like who I was good enough, and then started wearing women's clothes, and there was a whole other layer of shame. And so this idea that gender doesn't have to conform to man or woman was really liberating for me, and that my gender could be fluid, which is more than just you know, the hair and the makeup. It's more an essence of how I feel inside. And then there's sexuality where, you know, especially straight men, they're usually the ones who are most confused and aroused all at the same time. And I think it sort of inserts something into someone's perception as to go like, hang on, she looks like a woman, but she has a penis, and I think she's attractive. What does that mean? What does that make me?
What does that mean?
I think what it means is that our concept of sexuality is broken, and to say that there's gay and straight is kind of reductive. And I think now we're sort of starting to understand that sexuality and gender exist on a spectrum. But I just think that it's been so rigid for so long that if a straight identifying guy has sex with someone who looks like a woman but has a penis, it's like confusing, and they feel that it sort of rips something away from their identity. Like, if you want to identify as straight, you still can, but also on paper, I guess that is on the sexuality spectrum. You know, Kinsey's talked about this scale of sexuality, and that might put you on a 1 or a 2 on the scale as opposed to being a 0. But I think the funny thing is that people are scared to, especially straight men, are scared to sort of have something removed from their identity as opposed to seeing it as like adding to their identity.
So just to explain in a bit more detail, I mean, you've described yourself as pansexual. You know, some who are a bit more critical might just say, well, doesn't that just mean bisexual?
I mean, it kind of does. Bisexual is the, you know, better known term. It's been around for longer. People have fought and died for that word. And it sort of was, back in the day when it sort of came about, when our understanding of gender was where it was like, oh, bi, man, woman. And then as the years have evolved and as our understandings evolved, the term pansexual came about to sort of mean all genders. But then bisexual sort of has rebranded in a way, if you will, to sort of be attracted to genders the same as my own and genders different to my own. And sort of pansexual comes under the umbrella of bisexual. But my identification of pansexuality is just to say that I find someone attractive irrespective of their gender. I have been with women, I've been with trans people, I've been with men, and I'm not going to... If I meet someone and I think they're attractive and I have a spark, then I'm going to, you know, give it a crack.
In terms of the gender fluidity that you've described, I mean, it's been one of the buzz phrases of the past couple of years. A lot of people are becoming aware of the concept that we are all on a spectrum of some sort, between hyper-masculine and hyper-feminine. Do you see anything as you're obviously very, very pro this idea. Do you see anything negative in it, in us moving away from the old stereotypes of masculinity and femininity?
I think the only thing that could be negative is that people are so hell-bent on those concepts. And, like, really, we kind of just made up this idea that women wear pink and boys wear blue, and, like, there is obviously biological things about us that are different, but the actual concept of gender and gender roles in society is just something that we all agreed upon. It's kind of like this consensual reality where we're like, oh, okay, yep, men will do that, women will do that, right, got it, good. Nobody needs to think about it. And I think it gets confusing, and it does threaten some people's identities, but I think ultimately what you have to remember is if someone else is having a different experience from you, that's okay, and they can have that experience, and it doesn't affect or take away from your own experience. And I think, I just think it's really healthy for men and for women. You know, women, you know, grow up with these unrealistic beauty standards in magazines and gender roles. Men as well. I think men are even more castrated, dare I say, by their own rigid box of masculinity. Like, growing up with this idea that you have to be a man and creates a lot of shame and a lot of difficulty in a lot of men's minds because they aren't that, and they feel like they have to, like, not have emotions and be a man, and that's just not... I don't think that's actually true for 49% of the population.
But things are clearly changing. I mean, you know, I became a father 3 years ago, and actually I think being a kind of a kind, a generous, a kind of an emotion-driven parent is incredible. Is an incredibly masculine thing. So things are definitely shifting, aren't they?
And there's this idea of... So there's an idea of man and woman. There's an idea of male and female, and there's an idea of masculine and feminine. And we kind of often think that masculine, man, and male are all the same thing, and that feminine, female, and woman are all the same thing, but really they're 3, 6 different things. And I think that a lot of it is based in misogyny, where we think feminine is weak, it's less than, and so like men are fearful of this idea of being feminine or embracing emotions or feminine qualities. But feminine doesn't have to mean woman or female. It's just kind of these words that represent sort of qualities, and I think that can be confusing as well.
So where then does drag intersect with not just femininity, but with feminism itself as well?
Yeah, well, I think that drag kind of holds up a mirror to identity in many ways, and says, if, like, how performative is my gender presentation right now if I woke up as a different gender and I spent probably less time than Kim Kardashian spends, you know, getting ready to go on a TV show. So this idea of gender is kind of a bit peculiar, and I think that to sort of advertise how performative my feminine gender is right now sort of holds up a mirror to, you know, these rigid ideas of what women should look like. And I think when it comes to feminism, I'm a feminist. I support equality of the sexes. I understand that in our society we're certainly not there, and that there are many things that you know, men have historically been responsible for, and I think that being aware of those things and unpacking those things is really important, and I hope to be, you know, an ally to women, and be seen as somebody who supports the upliftment of women in our society.
I mean, I want to just focus on, you've described yourself in the past as polyamorous as well. Now, again, for a lot of people, that will be a concept, at the very least, that raises eyebrows, if indeed they've ever heard of it. So just explain a little bit more.
I don't believe that. I mean, it's funny because this idea of monogamy, right, used to mean married to one person for your entire life, not just one person at a time. It just meant one person. But in today's society, monogamy just means one person at a time. I have been in relationships before where I was in love with my partner, but I also understood that I could have, like it's funny when people go into relationships and there's this concept that, like, everybody suddenly in the world becomes unattractive. But I think we acknowledge that that isn't the case. And if I love someone and I find someone else attractive, it's not like pie. It's not like I've got a piece of pie and giving some to somebody else means that the person I love has got less pie. I think that, you know, I can love somebody and that is its own thing, and then I can also love or be attracted to somebody else.
So is there an ideal any longer then?
Not for me. The ideal is for the individual, I think, as opposed to a construct that society decided is appropriate. So I might fall in love with one person and be with them for the rest of my life. I might fall in love with nobody and be spinster Courtney, or I mean, you're
not ruling out that a monogamous relationship that would last the rest of your life?
No, not at all. It's more to do with what happens with my attraction. And it's not a flippant thing, sort of like, you know, I'm aware that the grass is greener, and I'm aware that, you know, I suppose, like, in my 20s, sexual attraction was much more of a, you know, a visceral sort of hormonal thing, whereas now in my 30s I kind of am probably more rational and less driven by body parts than I was back then. So it's not that I'm necessarily, like, seeking to have a harem of multiple partners. It's more that I understand that my love for somebody isn't defined by its exclusivity to them. Just as, like, you have parents and siblings and you love your, obviously in a different way to your partner, but you love your parents in individual ways, and you don't love one parent more and makes you love the other parent less. I think that sort of concept of love is something that's universal with your partners, with your family, with your friends, people that you love. And then obviously with a partner there is a sexual element that you don't have with those other people. I just think that it's more about breaking down the labels and saying this, whatever I feel is correct, rather than being told how to feel.
Do you think, though, that we can, we're talking the world can ever get there? I mean, on the one hand, I mean, I remember my mum and dad saying to me when I was very young, like, you know, gay, straight, whatever, you know, it's just a question of who you fancy, which for, you know, for the back then was not necessarily the most widely spread view, widely held view. Fast forward to today, and I think, you know, pretty much everyone that within my social circles would agree with that. But then you look to other parts of the world where perhaps religion is more dominant,
Yeah.
and, you know, LGBTQ are being abused on a daily basis.
Yeah. I mean, there's 36 countries in the British Commonwealth where it's still criminal to be queer in some way. And that's like just inside our own, you know, British Commonwealth. And it's kind of fascinating to think that because, you know, the Charter of Values of the Commonwealth are about, you know, equality and that, to me, if some people can still be put to death in some British Commonwealth countries for, you know, committing an act of sodomy, that's pretty crazy. Like, and that's a real thing. And I think that we in the West are very privileged now. You know, in the US, in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the UK, and you know, around Europe, that it's where we're so free to be who we want. And I think sometimes we forget that there are people who are being put to death or who are being beaten to death, and you know, people are dying, and like it's a very real thing that's happening in right now in history. And also we see, you know, a lot of fear-based politics sort of trying to take away those privileges that have been earned in recent times. And I think that it's important to not take those privileges for granted and also be aware that there are other people who don't have those, and not just with sexuality or with gender, but also, you know, reaching across the threshold to people who might be different to us and saying, I support, you know, people of colour, or I support women's rights, or I support, you know, disabled people's rights, and seeing that we can lift other people up and amplify their voices in the progress as well.